made available to provide general information and a general overview of legal principles. Viewers should not rely on the information provided without consulting an attorney who is licensed to provide legal advice. Topics and ideas shared on this show are not to be used as a substitute for legal advice from a licensed attorney in your state.
Welcome to Under Oath with Michelle Bell, and I'm your host, Michelle Bell. Now, this show is where I bring on fellow attorneys, and we give you, the audience, legal information. Now, I like to start off the show with a segment I call Jury Duty, and this is where I ask a trivia question, and you, the audience, get to submit your answer through the website, which is www.mbunderoath.com. Now, the first person to submit the correct answer will receive a gift as well as a mention on the next show. Now, today's jury duty question is, which one of these cartoons has not been made into its own movie? Teen Titans, Rugrats, Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, or SpongeBob SquarePants? All right, submit your answers. Now, don't go anywhere. We have a great show lined up with an awesome guest. We'll be right back.
I love taking care of my mom. It wasn't easy at first. She learned how to better communicate her needs.
And you learned how to not ignore yours.
I discovered how to make healthier meals.
And I discovered how much I enjoyed them.
Becoming a caregiver is a learning experience for everyone. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Hey, welcome back to Under Oath with Michelle Bell. Today, my guest is Mr. Leslie Orlando Perry. He's a licensed attorney in the District of Columbia courts, as well as bankruptcy courts in District of Columbia and Maryland. So, welcome, Mr. Perry. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. It's great to be here to be talking about something that I love to do.
Okay. Yeah. And what will be the subject you're discussing today?
Well, we're discussing landlord tenant law today.
So, how did you get into law?
Well, short story. My friend said he wanted to go to law school. He asked me to apply with him. I applied. He ended up going to graduate school. Long story short, that's how I got into law.
Okay, well, it worked out for you. So how long have you been practicing?
8 years in the District of Columbia. That's where I'm licensed at. And I'm from New York, so I know the Bronx, that is. I know, I don't hate to depress some people, but proud person from the Bronx that is down here in D.C. practicing landlord tenant law or real estate law in general.
Oh, great. So, okay, so let's get into the information so that the public knows a little bit more about landlord tenant. Now, you are going to be discussing landlord tenant in general as well as DC, or how are you going to work that?
Well, that's how I gear my presentations. I have a presentation that I would do at the public library here, and it will be general concepts about landlord tenant law, which can be very complicated at times, but I try to give specific nuances to the DC area, because it could be very, as they say, idiosyncratic or very technical at times.
Okay. Well, let's get into it.
Yeah, so the presentation is legal literacy. And I try to say legal literacy in that there's different areas of the law that people might think they know, but they really don't know. Even some attorneys, they might think they know certain things, but they really don't know. So I have different areas of the law that I discuss. And this one is landlord tenant law, which in DC can be very technical, as I said before. And I try to go through three main principles. One is that, what is landlord tenant law in general? Two, understanding landlord tenant law in the District of Columbia. And pretty much to say, I'm a landlord tenant attorney. Not a lot of people like to admit that, but that's what I am. I like helping people. I like helping tenants that might have issues. I love helping small landlords, which I'm also a small landlord in DC. So I like helping the groups of people that might need help because of the different issues that might come up. So the areas that I like to speak on today is the sources of landlord tenant law. Where does it come from? Some of the process, because that's some where lay people might come into court, they might not even know which way to go. I like to explain that you go to court and you just sit there and you listen, and that there's different things that you can do, even though you might not be an attorney. But I like to show the different areas of law they can learn from in that area. Knowing the meaning of contract and lease, explain the differences between federal law and District of Columbia law, and know the meaning of housing quality standards and rent control, and describe housing conditions court. And that last court is very important, where that's where tenants actually get to make their case about housing conditions.
Okay,
so,
sounds good.
So the first point I like to get into in the discussion is, what is landlord tenant law? So in my presentation, I like to discuss the 4 legs of it. Yes, it's like 4 legs on a table. Basically, there's different areas of law. We all know that the city of District of Columbia have city council. They make the laws for the city. Then you have contract law, which is certain rules that if you have a contract that you have to go by. Then you have judge-made law. This is where judges actually sit down and think about the issues and make decisions. And that is an area of law that we have to go by, or we call it case law. And administrative law, that's more where your agencies like your Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs or other agencies in DC, they have an area law which they have a set of rules that they go by. First of all, let's discuss landlord tenant law in general. Basically, it's contract law. I'm not trying to make it complicated, but contract is just an agreement between 2 more parties. That's it. You agree with party A that you're going to do something, and a party B says, okay, you're going to do it. It's a promise to each other. Now, I always think about landlord tenant law like this. You go into McDonald's. I call it the McDonald's concept. You say, hey, McDonald's, I want to buy a Big Mac. The person tells you, Big Mac is, what, $2.50. You take out your money, you give the person $2.50, hey, you have your Big Mac, they have their money. You keep on moving, as they say. Now, in landlord tenant law, it's no different. You pay a certain amount for rent. You agree to rent for whatever amount these days. It could be a little, I'm not going to say how much rent is these days, because it's more than what I paid when I was in an apartment. But anyway, you pay your rent by the 5th of the month usually, and you get to live there for the rest of the month. Now, the lease is the only thing the lease says is how long you're going to be there. Most leases start at a year. They could be shorter. They could be 6 months. They could be 9 months, whatever the needs of the parties. Or they used to have leases, 2-year leases, but they don't, for the most part, do that anymore. The leases are also guidelines, rules of the house, where you could say, I'm living here with my husband or a spouse or whatever, with my children. You identify who's there. You identify that I have 4 bedrooms. I identify that I'm paying for the utilities or they're paying for the gas. You identify the rules for each party. The landlord has certain rules that they have to go by, and the tenant has certain rules that they have to go by. And that is the heart of a lease.
Okay, now,
Okay,
it's been a while since I rented as well, but in the lease, like, they can be very long.
They can be.
So what happens if you get a lease and you actually read it, I know many people don't, but you actually read it and you don't like something that's in that lease, do you just say, no, I don't want to rent here? Or, hey, can we work this out?
Well, like any document, contract, it's a negotiation. It could be written down, that's what the landlord wants, but if you, like, again, if you're paying money, you have the ability to say, can I change this? But long as it's in writing, because in contractual law, when you're dealing with real estate, it has to be in writing. Okay, so let's get that out the way. Any changes to anything that you're agreeing to, especially lease, it should be in writing. Okay? So if it says that the landlord could have 4 inspections a year and the person's like, well, can it be 2 inspections a year? Yes, long as it is written in the lease clearly and it's initialed by both parties.
Okay, cool.
And again, leases can be very long. Always read your lease. Please, read your lease thoroughly, because there's certain little rules that the landlords are able to put in there to protect themselves, as they should, but it should be rules in there to protect the tenant also. Okay. So you have to make sure that that's in there. There's certain concepts in landlord tenant law in DC. You'll find that all the different branches contribute to landlord tenant law, and sometimes, you know, they agree to disagree on certain areas of the law, which is landlord tenant law.
That's life in general.
That's life in general. Judges might say this is a certain part of law that we made, but it might be contrary to something that might be in DCRA, or Department of Consumer Regulatory Affairs. So they reconcile it. So that's why we do have a court system to help reconcile those rules. The other area, this is funny, when you have a contract, you're building a relationship between the landlord and the tenant. And it's, I call it, you know, friend or frenemies. You know, my kids, you know, they say like, that's my frenemy. I was like, wait a minute. I get it, I understand, because sometimes your landlord can be your friend if y'all are working on the same page, if you have communication. Communication is key in any relationship, and especially for landlord-tenant.
Okay. Well, we're going to get ready to take a break so that the audience can digest everything that they've heard, and hopefully that's stuff that they did not know, and it will help them, you know, next time that they have to go through a lease or renew their lease or sign a new, read your lease. I know it's long, but read it. So hang in there. We'll be right back.
You made her college years possible, opening that education savings account when she was little, spearheading campus tours, and deciphering financial aid. If you can ace planning for college, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Welcome back to Under Oath with Michelle Bell. So I'm here with Mr. Leslie Orlando Perry, landlord tenant attorney in the District of Columbia. So now we're going to move into one of our segments called Office Hours. And that's the one where you, the viewers, sent in your legal questions to get answered.
Well, I'm going to try to answer them at least.
Well, let's see what the first question is.
Good afternoon, Mr. Perry. I have a landlord-tenant question. If the tenant pays partial payment, does that break the lease?
Now, thank you for that excellent question. Now, he asked if the tenant pays partial payment, does it break the lease? It does not necessarily break the lease. In DC, and I'll explain a little later, how if somebody doesn't pay all the rent, that's a sort of like breaking the lease, but you have to go to court to have somebody else make a determination if that lease was broken. Because there might be a reason why the tenant did not pay all the rent. It might be an issue in the apartment, it might be whatever. But there are legal reasons why a tenant may not pay all of the rent, and that's why we go to court to make that determination. But that's an excellent question, I like that.
Okay, so is that just in the District of Columbia, or is that across the board, that partial payment may not be an automatic lease breaker?
Well, generally, if you say the McDonald's concept where a Big Mac costs $2.50, and say that they give you half a Big Mac, Well, you might say, hey, I'm not going to pay $2.50 if I get a half a Big Mac. The same thing in the landlord-tenant relationship. If you are a tenant that's not receiving heat, that might cause an issue. So you might not want to pay all your rent. But the concept is that generally if there's an issue in the apartment and you don't pay all your money, you still have to go to court to resolve it. It doesn't mean that you officially broke the lease, but it means that somehow y'all need to resolve it.
Okay, so what happens if like the tenant just doesn't want to pay the rent? They don't really have a legitimate reason. They just
that's why the landlord is going to court to file what they call a complaint, and it describes how they broke the lease. If one of the conditions is that they pay a certain amount of dollars a month and they don't do that, that's breaking what we call a contract, the agreement between the two parties. You go to court and say, judge or whoever, this person did not pay their rent. They violated the lease. You could request money judgment, or you might want possession of your apartment back, and they have to move out, generally.
Okay. Oh, sounds good. I believe we have a second question. So let's see what that is.
I'm a landlord in the District of Columbia who has a tenant that has been residing in my property for several years. I don't have a lease. The tenant is behind in the rent, and I want to proceed to evict them. What steps do I need to undertake?
Wow, that's a very good question. Yeah, sometimes there are times where a landlord, for whatever reason, might allow a tenant to live in their apartment without a lease, without a formal contract. Mm-hmm. Now, generally, and in DC, if somebody lives in your apartment and they live over a certain amount of time, they could be considered an tenant or a tenant. So there's an agreement there. And if they stop paying a certain amount of money that you agreed upon verbally, then yes, you have to go to court. Now, it's going to be a little, I can't take up all the segment describing how you go about filing a complaint or whatever to get them out your apartment if they didn't pay or haven't paid in a little while. But yeah, you have a process to go through to formally say, hey, we did have an agreement, it wasn't written down, but they paid me this amount for the last few years and they stopped paying. So there's a process to do that, but you have to go to court, okay? You have to go to court.
Okay, so the landlord just can't come in and just take your stuff and throw it on the street?
No, in general, and especially not in DC.
Okay.
Okay, remember that. Not in DC.
Without going to court first. Without going to court first. You
best believe you need to go to court, and to throw anybody's stuff out, or to, I don't want to say throw anybody's stuff out, but to vacate an apartment, you have to go to the U.S. Marshal Service. It's a very formal process.
Okay. And I believe we have one more, but this one is an audio. So we have to listen to the question.
Very carefully.
I want to ask a question. When you pay a deposit, when you pay a security deposit, how long does it take to get it back after you move out?
Wow, that's a very good question. She's asking about security deposits. In DC, there's a statute, there's a law that talks about how security deposits are handled. A security deposit is where, before you move in your apartment, a landlord might request, okay, you have to pay your rent, and you might have to pay a deposit just in case at the end of your tenancy, there might be issues in there, so that security deposit will be used to resolve those issues. Okay. And DC has a very formal process of dealing with that, and most times the rule goes by, the maximum is 45 days to return a security deposit to the tenant if they left the apartment clean and what they call broom swept.
Okay, is there like a general rule when it comes to security deposits?
And this is one area of the law where it's specific to the jurisdiction. DC is very different than Maryland. Maryland is different than Virginia. So, but the general idea is that security deposit is given so that it's sort of like a way to protect both parties when a tenant might have to vacate an apartment.
Okay, cool. So thank you for actually answering the questions from office hours.
I tried.
The viewers that sent in the videos, thank you so much for doing that. Continue to watch, and hopefully you understood and got the answers from Mr. Perry. And you can give us feedback on the website.
Thank you.
Just to go back to where you were with the landlord-tenant information that you were giving to the public, you want to move into what area now?
I want to talk a little bit about sort of like the process. We talked about it a little through the questions, what happens if somebody doesn't pay the rent, for example. As a landlord, there's a formal process where you go to the court and you file some documents, okay? Let me tell you, DC is very good in general in having the documents online. So please go to your search or Google machine or your search engine and look up DC.
Google
DC,
machine?
Yes. Some people call it Google machine, where you put in, you Google DC Superior Court and you'll find landlord-tenant information, and it has a wealth of information in there.
Okay.
A lot of information. The website for DC has a wealth of information about landlord-tenant relationships, how they should be handled, and a lot of that information is handled through the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. So the process is that as a landlord, you go to 510 4th Street, that's downtown where all the courts are at. It's Court B. And you go, if you have any questions, there's opportunities for you to ask the clerk. But for any legal questions, you could go to the Landlord Tenant Resource Center. Landlord tenant issues are very well handled by a resource center that's on site, one, if you have any issues that you might not be able to handle. Two, there's different resource organizations in the city to help you handle the questions, similar questions that the viewers that came on here asked. Okay. So there's Bread for the City. There's all these very good organizations to answer a lot of questions. Landlord Tenant Resource Center does listen to landlord questions also.
Okay. So to give the process, we want to do a quick run of the complete process. So you know that you have an issue, you need to be a landlord-tenant court, you go down to the building.
You fill out your paperwork, you give it to the clerk get back to you, then you serve. You serve the tenant. It has to be through a process.
So you're doing it from the landlord perspective?
I'm doing it from the landlord perspective.
Okay.
Now, if there's I don't want to get too thick in the weeds with it.
Well, just in general, a list.
So you want to, as a landlord, you want to go to the courthouse to get the filing in and have it properly served so you can go to court. If you're a tenant, if you receive anything, go to the Landlord Tenant Resource Center to ask them, how do I deal with this? Okay.
And once that's done,
you go to court, you get a court date. At the court date, you get to talk to the judge. After you get to talk to the judge, then you start to resolve it. Mediation, I suggest getting into the mediation process quickly and often. That will help you to get to understand each other's issues, because mediation will help you to discuss issues that you might not have known existed. Talking through a third person. Mediation is where you have a third party that is not anybody's attorney. They just there to listen to the issues, to help you resolve the issues that you and your landlord might have. As a tenant, they could be very helpful to understanding the concepts. Okay. They're not an attorney usually.
All right, well, mediation, I know from my personal experience going to mediation with clients, it's easier because both parties give something and both parties give up something to come to some sort of agreement. Whereas if a judge makes the decision for you, one party wins, one party loses.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, so if mediation doesn't work?
Then the next step after mediation is you might have to go through a formal, what they call litigation process, where you have to exchange some papers to see how much you might owe, if there might be issues in the apartment, or if there's other things that's outside. But you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding what the issues are when you go in front of the judge.
All right, so then you go in front of the judge, you have your trial, and then the judge makes the decision.
Judge, sometimes it's a judge decision that is made, or you might, as a tenant or anybody, might request a jury trial. You still have a right to a jury trial in the landlord-tenant process, yes.
Well, that sounds like great information. If you want more information, definitely reach out to, Mr. Perry. Okay, now we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with the great segments, my favorite. You have Plead the Fifth, and you have Cheat Sheet.
Most party fouls are pretty dumb. But if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Underage drinking and driving, the ultimate party foul.
Welcome back to Under Oath with Michelle Bell. I'm here with Mr. Leslie Orlando Perry, a landlord tenant attorney in the District of Columbia. So now we're going to move into one of my favorite segments, which is Plead the Fifth. So Mr. Perry, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you either answer them or you plead the fifth.
Okay.
You ready?
Ready.
All right. 90s R&B or today's R&B?
90s.
Do you like chick flicks?
Yes.
Which one?
27 Dresses. I know, right?
Sports or debate team?
Sports.
Okay. Most embarrassing moment in court?
Plead the fifth. Definitely.
Okay. Guilty pleasure song you play and dance to when no one's looking?
Gloria Gaynor. I know.
Which one?
I Will Survive.
Oh, wow. Craziest thing you did in college?
Woo. Plead the fifth. Definitely.
Well.
Oh.
That's the end of the segment.
Excellent.
So now we're going to go into the next segment, which is Cheat Sheet. Now, Cheat Sheet is where we give legal tips in layman's terms. So what tips do you have for the audience?
Well, simple. Read your lease. We talked about leases as contracts. Read it thoroughly. 2, for landlords, no general leases. Get a DC-specific lease, please. Communicate with each other. Talk with each other real quickly about any issues. And 3, document everything. If you send a note to your landlord or the tenant, vice versa, document it. Very simple, those 3 things.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for those tips, Mr. Perry. So now I'm going to say thank you so much for being here. And how can they reach you, Mr. Perry, if they have questions about landlord-tenant?
Easy. Orlando at lperrylaw.com. As Orlando as in Orlando, Florida, at lperrylaw.com. Thank you. Please send me email.
Well, thank you, Mr. Perry, for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure being here.
Great. And I thank you, the audience, for tuning in. And I also thank you for sending in those great questions for office hours. That was wonderful. Keep them coming. You can submit those, and if there's questions you want me to read or ask on Plead the Fifth, you can submit those as well. Just go to the website, which is www.mbunderoath.com, submit them, and see what else is on the website. It's all information just for you. Till next time.